Shall we?
So, this is our fourth session.
Yes.
And so, we'll be looking at roughly the next surah in Revelation. This is Surah Qalam. Qalam means pen. And I say roughly, as we'll see, we've talked about how the verses, the ayahs, came down at times that were relevant for the community in the place. Okay? And not in the order of the Quran that it is today. So that order was finalized near the end of the prophethood, in about 631, 632. And so there are pieces of this that are going to be from that early period that are sort of the second revelation, and there are pieces of it that are sort of a little bit later. But instead of sort of jumping around more than we already are, I figured we'll just kind of do the entire chapter. So I wanted to talk about that just to make sure we have the back and forth. So I think what we'll do, we talked about this last time, we'll listen to it, and even though we're not going to understand everything, you sort of get an idea of what it sounds like. And what I'll start doing is maybe I'll start using different reciters. So you'll just hear slight changes. Everybody has sort of, I won't say a different style, but just a different voice when they recite it. So let's see. So this is Surah Qalam. And then at the beginning, we'll talk more about this. There's a letter that gets sort of elongated. There's a long recitation for it. So that's right at the beginning. Just be on the lookout for that, and then we'll just listen to the rest.
والقلم وما يسطرون ما أنت بنعمة ربك بمجنون وإن لك لأجرا غير ممنون وإنك لعلى خلق عظيم فستبصر ويبصرون بأيكم المفتون إن ربك هو أعلم بمن ضل عن سبيله وهو أعلم بالمهتدين فلا تطع المكذبين ودوا لو تدهن فيدهنون ولا تطع كل حلاف مهين هماز مشاء بنميم مناع للخير معتد أثيم عتل بعد ذلك زنيم أن كان ذا مال وبنين إذا تتلى عليه آياتنا قال أساطير الأولين سنسمه على الخرطوم إنا بلوناهم كما بلونا أصحاب الجنة إذ أقسموا ليصرمنها مصبحين ولا يستثنون فطاف عليها طائف من ربك وهم نائمون فأصبحت كالصريم فتنادوا مصبحين أن اغدوا على حرثكم إن كنتم صارمين فانطلقوا وهم يتخافتون ألا يدخلنها اليوم عليكم مسكين وغدوا على حرد قادرين فلما رأوها قالوا إنا لضالون بل نحن محرومون قال أوسطهم ألم أقل لكم لولا تسبحون قالوا سبحان ربنا إنا كنا ظالمين فأقبل بعضهم على بعض يتلاومون قالوا يا ويلنا إنا كنا طاغين عسى ربنا أن يبدلنا خيرا منها إنا إلى ربنا راغبون كذلك العذاب ولعذاب الآخرة أكبر لو كانوا يعلمون إن للمتقين عند ربهم جنات النعيم أفنجعل المسلمين كالمجرمين ما لكم كيف تحكمون أم لكم كتاب فيه تدرسون إن لكم فيه لما تخيرون أم لكم أيمان علينا بالغة إلى يوم القيامة إن لكم لما تحكمون سلهم أيهم بذلك زعيم أم لهم شركاء فليأتوا بشركائهم إن كانوا صادقين يوم يكشف عن ساق ويدعون إلى السجود فلا يستطيعون خاشعة أبصارهم ترهقهم ذلة وقد كانوا يدعون إلى السجود وهم سالمون فذرني ومن يكذب بهذا الحديث سنستدرجهم من حيث لا يعلمون وأملي لهم إن كيدي متين أم تسألهم أجرا فهم من مغرم مثقلون أم عندهم الغيب فهم يكتبون فاصبر لحكم ربك ولا تكن كصاحب الحوت إذ نادى وهو مكظوم لولا أن تداركه نعمة من ربه لنبذ بالعراء وهو مذموم فاجتباه ربه فجعله من الصالحين وإن يكاد الذين كفروا ليزلقونك بأبصارهم لما سمعوا الذكر ويقولون إنه لمجنون وما هو إلا ذكر للعالمين.
Okay, so 7 minutes, not short, but not really long. It's just sort of like a medium length one. Any comments, any thoughts that come from just listening to it.
I was struck by how many verses end in an sound or sound.
Okay, good.
I was struck with how rhythmical it is. I noticed a lot of us were tapping our foot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Was it all memorized, the person that was doing that it was all in their head?
Yeah, I mean, if somebody is reciting at that level of recitation, they're very, very likely to be a hafiz, a memorizer, technically a preserver of the Quran, but part of that is memorizing it. Yeah.
Well, it reminded me of the cantor in a Jewish synagogue
Yep.
service. In the same kind of, is that sort of the way it is in the service?
I know of the cantor, I don't know,
They sing a lot of the Jewish service.
Yeah.
In,
I don't know what the training for a cantor is and what the sort of station of a cantor is with respect to a rabbi in the Judaic tradition, so I couldn't quite tell it, but there is some parallel in that there's obviously a recitation, there's a rhythm, there's a tune. Those tunes that while they're from reciter to reciter, there are some personalizations, but there are sort of general rules of recitation. So some of the elongations that you have, those would be across all reciters. They might elongate a little bit differently. Somebody might do it a 4 count, somebody might do it a 6 count. They're sort of personal.
So it's just like playing an instrument or singing, it's praised.
There's some
Voice rises and falls.
There's some rises and falls to it depending on, and there's different rules for when these two particular sounds are next to each other, then you link the sounds. If they're not, then they're done in different ways. There's dozens of like little rules of what's called tajweed. Tajweed is sort of proper recitation. So all the little markings that you see at the top, those would not be there sort of in the original Quran. So the original Quran is a vocal recitation, right, from Gabriel to Muhammad, Muhammad to the people. Muhammad's scribes write it down, but they're not using those like little diacritical marks. Those are vowelings. That tells me, so this is the letter fa, like the F sound, so should that be a fa, fi, fu? What vowel should go with it? That's what tells me that. Now, native Arabic speakers don't need those. They sort of instinctively know that that's what comes. Just like in first grade, I don't know if they do it anymore, right? But in first grade, above the A, there was like a little boat that tells you it was a short A, it was a long A, things like that. Gradually, we don't need those. We know wake has a long A because we instinctively know it's an E. All those things are done like a snap, right? But for those who are non-native speakers, they're going to need those or else they can make slight mistakes. And those mistakes could be very serious. Like, depending on the sound, it could completely change the meaning of the word, it could flip the meaning of the word, things like that. So those were added in probably within the first 50 or 60 years to help as Muslims became, as people who are non-Arabs became Muslim, particularly in Persia first, and the native Arabs noticed like, oh, you guys are screwing this all up. We need to like put something in to help you out. But what I wanted to focus on was what you noticed right away, that every single verse ended in a sort of an N sound, right? A nasally N sound. That doesn't mean anything in itself, but it shows that rhythmic meter that helps people. One of the things it does is help people remember it. And from a Muslim point of view, the fact that you can have 50 verses that go together, that have like profound meaning, and that have a metered rhythmic cohesiveness to them is a sign of its sort of special divine origin, right? The fact that a human being could not come up with this. That's how Muslims understand when they read these things. They feel that way. So that's something to be appreciative of. And it's not that so all the verses ended in either the meme sound, which is sort of the M sound, or the noon sound. But even the ones that ended in the meme sound, there's a way that some of these sound, so this little double thing, when it's like that, it means that M sounds like a So it would be like moon, and again, then you end up with the N sound. Right? So all of these have that ending. All 52 verses end in that way. So, and then the other thing, actually we can go to the slides to know about the other thing. I'll bounce back and forth between these slides. So at the beginning, you heard this long noon, the reciter did it that way, right? And that's just a letter. He's just calling, sort of, not saying na or nu, he's just saying, it's sort of like a, instead of saying a, he said a. Or instead of saying he said n, right? And so at the beginning of 29 of the 114 verses, there are sort of what are called disconnected letters. So there's what seemingly may look like a random smattering of letters at the beginning. They might be a letter, they may be two letters, they may be three. Occasionally there's four. And they're not pronounced with vowel, they're just pronounced by the name of the letter. So the name of this letter is Noon, so it's just said Noon. Usually it's an elongated sound. And what does it mean? No human being knows. It's mysterious, the meaning is truly unknown. Scholars will say the meaning is only known to God. Why is there just a letter, not a word, a particular letter at the beginning? So at the beginning of the second verse, one of the bigger verses, it starts with Alif, Lam, Mim. Nobody knows what it means. So it's recited with the letters. Again, that's part of sort of the mystery of the unknown, that human beings, as much as they try to, there's lots of parts of the text, obviously, that commentators will commentate on and, extrude understandings from. These letters, there's not that much to do. People still try. So there are some commentators who will say, oh, this may mean this. This seems like an interesting link that I saw the noon here, I saw the noon here, these two verses have this, but there's never a general agreement, even remotely. So people sort of put out their thing. In the last, I guess starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, to my understanding, there's been a few people, I don't know if they're scholars or not, so I'm just using the word people, who have sort of used a numerical system and assigned different numbers to the letters, and then sort of a version of numerology to say like, oh, noon means this, that, and so that for it. It hasn't really had a lot of traction, but I just want to share that in sort of modern times, people continue to try to figure out what it may mean, even though they will never really figure out what it exactly means. Now let's get to the main thing. So the structure of this verse is roughly broken up into 6 parts. There's the first 10 verses. Those are the second verses revealed. So we talked about last time those first verses in the beginning of Surah Allah, Surah 96, about read in the name of your Lord. Those were the first. Then these come out. There's 2 sets that come from Makkah. Then there's a second piece in the middle that comes much later in Medina. Much later being probably like 10 years later. There's a few more Muckim and a few, so they're interspersed. So the chronological order is sort of back and forth in the verse. And then we can kind of go into now what is talked about and what's going on here. So remember, the last time we had the recitation of read in the name of your Lord, that happened in the cave. We talked about that the prophet was freaked out. He sort of runs home. And this verse and the next few verses talk about that event, about coming home and him sort of being freaked out and being comforted by his wife, Khadijah. Okay. So there's the noon, and then by all they write, or by the pen, by all they write, by the pen, the record which men write. Your Lord's grace does not make you a crazy person, a madman, does not make you possessed. So he himself is thinking like, I'm freaking out here, like what's going on? And so this comes a little bit later. So the event in the cave happens, he comes home, he's freaked out, and some period of days or weeks go by, and then this is sort of revealed to him that you're okay. This is gonna be a lot of weight on you, but we're gonna walk you through it. So your Lord's grace does not make you a madman. We'll read a couple different translations.
So this would be Gabriel talking to him.
Yeah, so all of these revelations through the Quran are Gabriel reciting to him. So reciting to him, sometimes in the cave, sometimes at home. It becomes more of a frequent thing. Thou art not, by the grace of your Lord, possessed. You're not a mad person. You will have a never-ending reward. Truly, you have a strong character. You have an exalted character. And so this is something that resonates with him because this is what his wife tells him. Like when he comes home and he's like, I don't know what's going on. Like maybe I've been cursed or something like that. So these first verses say like, A, you're not crazy. B, you're not cursed. C, you have high character. And his wife tells him, before even this is revealed, that everybody in town knows you as a good person. Like, God is not going to forsake a good person, a person who takes care of family, takes care of the orphans, looks out for the poor. This is what you've been doing in town your whole life. And so it's sort of reminded here. And soon they will see which of you is afflicted with madness. So we'll soon figure out who is really not with it, who doesn't have their wits about them. Is it you, or is it the people who deny truth when it comes to them in their face? One of the interesting side notes about the character of the prophet is, as time goes on, as the revelations come, and eventually as he starts preaching the oneness of God and not the idolatry of the society, gets a lot of pushback. But he continues to be sort of their custodian. So even people who are against him, who are plotting against him, they will still leave stuff with him when they go on a trip. So this is a traveling caravan merchant society. Right? So people will go on a trip, they'll have goods, they'll go sell it in Damascus and then come back, they'll be gone for 3 months or whatever time it takes. And in the meantime, they're like, oh, I have this other stuff that I'm not taking. There's no bank, there's no safe deposit box. Who do you leave it with? You leave it with trusted people in town. And he was one of his nicknames is the trusted one, the trustworthy one. And so even his adversaries would leave stuff with him in confidence that, like, I'm going to be gone for 3 months, can you look out for my stuff? So it shows, so Muslims often point to that to show that his character was so exemplary. Even the people who were plotting against him knew that he wouldn't screw them over on like sort of worldly matters.
I have a question. So during this time, in the very beginning when he was getting the revelations from Gabriel,
Yeah.
who was he telling beside his wife of what he was hearing?
The first, initially it's just his wife, then it's his household. And his household at that time, importantly, has a young boy. I don't know exactly how old he is at that point, 6, 8, something like that is my guess. Ali, who's his cousin. His cousin is basically staying with him as an adopted son because of financially, Ali's parents are unable to like sustain their entire household. So Ali essentially stays next door or down the alleyway with Muhammad. So Khadija is the first convert, his wife, and then Ali is the second. So, and he's a youngish boy at that time. And then the balance of the household, whoever else is in the household. For the first couple of years, it's very tight. Some close extended family, but that's about it. The public preaching really starts up about 2 or 3 years into it. And that's when they start really feeling the backlash.
And that's when they're telling, this tight family, as I'm calling him a madman, it's when he starts preaching.
Yeah.
To the,
So this thing about you're not a madman is talking to himself.
I say, yeah.
Because he himself initially is thinking, because when he comes back from the cave and he's talking to Khadija, his wife, he's like, this is what I experienced. I don't know what's going on. Maybe I'm going crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is more to counsel and comfort him that he is not going crazy. So, as we said, these verses are sort of interspersed with these early ones and some not so early ones. So we're going to go back and forth a little bit. But yeah, your question is initially it's just the initial close family, and then gradually some extended family, and about year 2 or 3, the wider town.
And I forget, what religion were they practicing prior to this, his family?
So his family, along with him, they were, in the Islamic tradition, they're known as what are called Hanifs. So they were monotheists, but not any particular tradition. So they weren't Jewish, they weren't Christian, they were sort of generally believing in God.
Okay.
But they were not taking part in the idolatry of the society at the time.
So when, so were these written down as Muhammad recited them? Because how can you remember all this for someone else to write it down later?
That's a good question. So I'm not sure when they first started to get written down. It may be, so it wasn't right away because he doesn't write, and I don't think anybody in his household at that time writes. Eventually Ali does become a literate scribe, but at that age I'm not sure if he was. But these verses, A, they're easy to remember because of the rhythmicness. B, actually, I should say, A is, society is an oral society to begin with. People remember stuff in a way that we can't fully appreciate, maybe even imagine. I'll give you sort of an example or an anecdote of sorts. Everybody in this room knows a time when you could remember lots of phone numbers. Nowadays, people are shocked that you could remember more than like 3 phone numbers. Right? But there was a time, like, I remember I knew my dad's work number, I knew my home number, I knew this number. There's a whole set of phone numbers you knew. And it wasn't a big deal. Everybody knew 10 or 20 phone numbers. Right? And now that is a big deal. Similarly, it's a hard anecdote, it's a hard analogy to stretch, but similarly, pre-modern societies, particularly societies that were not very big on writing, while there was writing in pre-Islamic Arabian societies, it was very, very limited. There's no paper. It's all on sort of parchment and animal skin and things like that. So it's very limited, it's very expensive, very few people have access to it. The way you communicate and the way you remember stuff is through an oral tradition. A lot of it's in poetry. A lot of the pre-Islamic Arabian conversations are in poetry. So poetry is a really big part of their society. Again, I can say these things. I don't think I can even fully appreciate them because it's hard to understand because we have grown up, our parents have grown up in a writing-based society for so long that an oral society is very hard for us to fully appreciate that people could remember so much. But they did. And I guess they also had a lot less distractions. Things. So for a variety of, I've had like friends of mine who have gone to like, let's say, study the Quran in Oman, sort of with a sort of traditional teacher out in the desert or in a small town or something, and they'll remark on when they come back that like they were memorizing like 3 or 4 pages a day, and whereas here in Philadelphia or Virginia or wherever they were growing up, they struggled to memorize maybe a verse or 2 a day. So it's the same person, it's the same time, they're still 20 years old, but because they're in a different environment, they have a lot less distractions. They're just focused on this one task. So maybe that gives us a little bit of a clue into what it may have been like in some of these pre-modern, primarily pre-written type of societies. So your Lord knows best who strays from his path and who is rightly guided. So that's what comes in the first piece here, right? The nature of belief and disbelief is sort of a shorthand for it. Right? And then we'll come back to this theme again. The second piece of it comes to us reminding these folks initially, and then people broadly, anybody who's reading, to not compromise on core beliefs. Okay? So first we'll read some of them, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So do not yield to those who deny the truth. They want you, so this is specifically in their place and time. This is their sort of pagan neighbors. They want you to compromise with them, and then they will compromise with you. So on the face of it, that sounds very nice, like, oh, compromise is a good thing. But this is about compromising on core belief, on the oneness of God versus the idolatry of God. So do not yield to those who swear. So they're swearing on things that are not meaningful, right? They're swearing on these idols. And this is a society that's known for sort of back-dealing, backbiting. So the Quran is sort of reminding the reader, be careful on whom you are making deals with. The hinder of good, anyone who is sinful or aggressive, coarse, or an imposter. And this is a society where, I mean, our society, many societies, physical wealth has stature. And this is a society where having progeny, having a large family, has also stature. And I think that's true in many places. So just because they have wealth or sons or children, that doesn't mean you should sort of give in. Don't give in to the earthly thing. When our revelations are recited to him, they say these are just ancient fables. So these are people who they're hearing the truth, but their hearts are not being moved. They're sort of sticking to their physically worldly possessions. Oh, I have wealth, I have a large family. And then the Quran sort of says then that they'll be sort of called out and they'll be sort of branded for who they are. Where's word 17? Okay, so we'll sort of pause there. And what I want to do is share another quick clip. This is from the movie that we saw at the beginning. So I mentioned that to not compromise is being mentioned here. And the compromise in a specific thing about core beliefs. So this clip here sort of shows a little bit of that interaction that's going on.
Tell him, we will give him authority, position, the keys to the Kaaba, and money, what money he wants. Tell him, we will give him anything he wants.
Mohammed, spare yourself and me. Do not put a greater burden on an old man than he can bear. In your childhood, you were in my arms. I cannot now see you hurt. If you refuse them, they will hurt you. He said this to me. Were they to put the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, I would not renounce my message, which is from God.
So that's sort of a little bit of the background. So the initial scene was sort of the pagan Meccans, the powers that be, and many of them are his sort of uncles. They're his relatives. I mean, he gets some of the biggest pushback from some of his sort of uncles, paternal uncles, things like that. But the other person, the person who takes the message to him, who talks to him directly, is his one of his paternal uncles who protects him, who uses his sort of political and social stature to protect him. This is a tribal society. Abu Talib is that guy. That is Ali's father. And Abu Talib sort of protects him and is sort of a messenger, but he's sort of in between. Because at this point, he's not a Muslim. He continues to be a pagan, but he's a pagan who sort of protects his nephew. In the Sunni tradition, he never converts. Like he remains a pagan his whole life, and he dies in that state. In the Shia tradition, he does convert. So beyond that, I couldn't get into the details of it, but it's interesting that the two traditions have different understandings of where he happens. In both traditions, there is, I think, that the Prophet Muhammad on Abu Talib's deathbed, as he's waiting for it with his uncle, he's like, just say the creed, just say it with me. And his uncle is sort of like, I love you, I take care of you. But he's sort of in the Sunni tradition, he's very tied to the tradition of his forefathers. It's hard for him to let that go, even though he sees all the challenges around it. So that's sort of the background to the verses about not compromising. What is going on in society? that he's sort of starting to shake up society a little bit as he starts to publicly preach, and people and the powers that be are saying, what can we give to you so you will like buckle down and shut up, basically. And at this point, this second one, so this one comes early, this one comes a little bit later also in Mecca, and it's saying, don't compromise on these things. Beware of these people. They're not compromising for a good purpose. They're compromising to basically uphold the current order of things. Any thoughts, questions with that?
When you have the translation written up there, sometimes a verse is repeated 3 times.
Yeah, I'm just
And is
showing.
that the way it would be in the original, the
No.
one in Arabic or not?
No, so the Arabic, I'm just showing 3 different translations.
Oh, okay.
So this is the translation that you guys have.
Yeah.
This was a popular translation into English in the first half of the 20th century, and this is another translator from India.
Because it's so rhythmic, I would imagine it wouldn't be a problem to have it repeated. That's how I was looking at it.
There are times when things are sort of restated or similar things are repeated, but not usually like
Those
that.
are the translations.
Yeah, those are just different translations. Yeah. So then there's a story called a parable of the garden. So we'll read through that. So we have tried them, meaning we've given them challenging a life or something, and we tried the owners of a certain garden who swore they would harvest its fruits in the morning. So there's some people at some place in time, this is not specifically in Arabia or Mecca, just a general story, that promise themselves, tomorrow morning we'll harvest. Who made no allowance for the will of God. So they said, we're going to do this tomorrow, and didn't sort of say, we'll do this tomorrow if it's in God's plan for us to do this tomorrow. They sort of left God out of it in their speech and in their hearts. So that's an important piece of the story here. It's a disaster from your Lord struck the garden as they slept, and by morning it was stripped bare, a desolate land. Still they called to each other at daybreak, go early to your field if you wish to gather all its fruits. They went off whispering, make sure no poor person enters the garden today. They left early bent on their purpose. So a couple of the lessons that are coming out of the story is they assumed they could do something without God's power. They sort of were invested in their own abilities rather than God's will. Number 2 is once something challenging happened, rather than turning toward God and saying, we forgot about God or we overemphasized our own power or something like that, they continued down the road to the point where they're like, okay, the harvest is going to be less. Make sure none of the poor people in town get in here and get any scraps. Right? So they're hoarding and being miserly. They left early, bent on their purpose, but when they saw the garden, they said, we have lost our way. No, we are ruined. The wisest of them say, did I not say, will you not glorify God? They said, glory be to God, our Lord. Truly, we are doing wrong. Then they turned to each other in mutual reproach. They said, alas for us, we have done a terrible wrong, but maybe our Lord will give us something better in its place. We truly turn to him in hope. I think that's 32. So such is the punishment in this life, but greater still is the punishment in the hereafter. If only they knew, there will be gardens of bliss for those who are mindful of God. So that's sort of the conclusion of the story.
I have a question that if they had said it sort of from the context of the story, if they had said, let us go and harvest God willing, how would they know if God was willing? Or, I mean, so that they could say it, but how would they have an affirmation of whether he was or he wasn't?
So we don't know when we say God willing. It's just sort of an acknowledgement that things don't happen other than through God's will. And so there's this phrase that you probably have heard of that Muslims use, inshallah, right? Sometimes it gets sort of abused to the point where inshallah sort of means, yeah, I'll get to it. But what it really should mean is, yeah, I'll come over tomorrow for dinner, God willing. I don't know if I'm going to have a heart attack. I don't know if I'm going to get into a car accident. If it isn't God's plan, I will make every effort and intention to be at dinner at your house tomorrow. That's what it's supposed to, that's the intent. Sometimes in practical life, it's like, so you're going to come over tomorrow? Yeah, inshallah, I'll come over. It's like, yeah, get off my back. I'll get there if I get there. I don't know. But the real meaning is to constantly use that phrase to remind yourself that nothing happens without his command, without God's command.
So is it pretty common then for people to say that often?
I think it is common, yeah. I mean, people will...
Do you do that?
I don't. Not good. Because there are other parts of the Quran that really call that out. That saying that not acknowledging of it is a problem. So, I mean, whether you say it explicitly, whether you sort of internalize it, whether you have an understanding of it, these are sort of like up for question. But the real danger is where we get to the point where like we think we're in control of everything. So from an Islamic point of view, that God is in control of everything. And this really gets into the questions of, I mean, we're not going to get into it, but it really gets into the perennial questions, like always questions of like God's will, human agency, how does that fit together? And I don't have an answer for you other than that they both are valid. They both work together. Sometimes the way I understand it for myself is that God's will controls everything, but from my frame of reference, I see and feel that I have agency. And so that is what I am accountable for, whatever agency I think I have. There's, even for the people who have like, the scholars who have the most sort of strict, narrow understanding of human agency, they would say that everything happens by God's will. Like, so if I do something wrong, that was by God's will, right? But what that still means is I still have the internal ability to be thankful for when I do something positive. I'll say, Alhamdulillah for taking care of my family, whatever it is. And then if I do something not good, that I ask for God's forgiveness, even though intellectually it was not in my agency. All I'm asked to do is be thankful to God and ask for God's forgiveness. That's the end of it. So the people who have the most narrow understanding of human agency would have that. People who have, in the Islamic tradition, have a greater understanding of human agency, have different understandings of that. But regardless of that, there's some understanding of this intertwining. And I know some scholars, and these tend to be the more spiritual scholars, will say that prayers, not any kind of prayer, but particularly the dua prayers, those prayers that come from the heart, that ask for help, ask for assistance, whatever, that personal conversation, that those, so Allah, God's sort of decree, God's plan is sort of, if you want to physically think about it, is coming down, and our prayers, our hopes are going up, and they sort of intertwine in some sort of spiritual way, and that's how God's plan is sort of altered. As soon as I say God's plan is altered, that's sort of a whole different can of worms theologically. But that's a way that some spiritual Muslims understand how prayers are impacted in a way. there's lots, none of this is the Islamic answer. There are Muslims who do understand it this way. And there are Muslims who would say, like, that's almost like borderline heresy. The fact that you're saying that God's will changes because of something a person prayed. But they're all part of the broad Islamic tradition, these different interpretive, spiritual, contemplative practices. I just wanted to sort of share with you that even the most limited understanding of human agency also has sort of limited thing to be accountable for. If you have limited agency, you just have to be thankful and ask for forgiveness. If you have more agency, then maybe you have a little bit more.
I have a question apropos of that, because, and this may be just our misunderstanding, but, that, from what you're saying, that if you go out and shoot somebody, that's God's will. And, that could be interpreted as being that's God's will, and there's no personal agency, so you're really not accountable for it. And yet, what we hear about is that there's a lot, that person who did it might be put to death right away because they did something so heinous. So how does that get reconciled? Or is that just we hear those things, but is that what we're not understanding something?
There's a lot more, different societies implement justice in different ways, even within the Muslim context. So we're sort of sliding a little bit outside of it, but I'll quickly talk about it. Even, we haven't run across any verses of sort of law yet, right? And there's relatively few, I want to say less than 6 or 7% of the Quran is law. Whenever there is a legal type of verse, within a verse or two after that, there's almost always something to the effect, paraphrasing, God is the ultimate judge, God sees all, God knows all, or something about Judgment Day, something like that. And it's a reminder to the judge and jury to not get all hopped up on power on earth. That there is a need and a right for society to have a regulation of justice, but that it is going to be imperfect, and to not overstep it. That ultimately, and there's something that the Prophet said, that it's better to be lenient than to be harsh in terms of judgment, because in terms of being harsh, you can overstep your bounds. Right? So I can use a silly example. Since Todd was being pushing around the other day, or last night, or whenever it was. Let's say Todd pushes me. Right? And so I have then, he has sort of violated something of mine. So I have the right to push back. Right? I don't have the obligation to. I could sort of let it go. And the Quran many, many times would say it would be better if you would just let these things pass. But I have the right to. Now, if I push back with 1 micronewton of more force than he pushed me back with, then I have taken my justice and then some, and now I am liable. Right? And I may do that without knowing. I'm not going to know that I pushed him a little bit harder than he pushed me. But God knows. And then on Judgment Day, I was like, Todd, whatever punishment you should have gotten, you endured on earth. You were good. Ashek, you pushed Todd more, and so you're accountable now for what you were not held to be account on earth. So that's a way to understand why it's better to err on the side of compassion and softness. And most Muslim societies did this. There's very few instances of these judgments actually being met out. So there's an example, and it's from the prophet's time. So there's an example in the prophet's time. They were having a difficult time, right? What we would call a recession or depression or something like that. Economically, things are tough. And somebody stole stuff out of desperation. And, the prophet said, actually not the prophet, one of the prophet's companions said to him, stop this and leave. Basically let him go, right? Caught him and then let him go. Knowing that this person was stealing out of desperation, out of economic desperation, physical food desperation, right? And that on a holistic basis, it would not be just to hold somebody to account when society at large was failing to provide. There was an inequity in society. God gave enough food, clothing, shelter on earth. Human beings organized their society in such a way that some portions of their society did not have access to that, and then out of desperation, this person does this. And so there are modern Muslim scholars, both in the States and overseas, who have argued that all sort of physical punishments in the Islamic tradition should be sort of suspended because there isn't a society on earth where they're not implemented in an unfair manner. So they are God's commandments, but they're implemented in such a way that they don't actually implement justice. You could go to one of the, I was going to say the Gulf monarchies, but you can go to pretty much any country, and if you're wealthy, you get a different type of justice than if you were a street sweeper. That's the unfortunate reality of our world. And so in that world, if you implement these types of punishments, they sort of further perpetuate injustice. Right? And they turn people away from faith. They say, if that's what faith is, then I really have no interest in it. So that doesn't really answer your question, but it kind of, because it opens a giant door of conversation. Sorry. No, it's not sorry. It's good. That's exactly what you want to happen in these discussion circles. And then you can think about this in your own tradition. What are the ways that people in the tradition implement it or don't implement it?
Yeah, I just had a question going back to the verse. So these guys are not making an allowance for the will of God.
Yeah.
And so the gardens are destroyed. And then they come back and say, glory be to God, etc. And then they said, alas for us, we have been terrible wrong, but maybe our Lord will give us something better in its place. Okay? So they're looking okay, I'm now doing what God is saying I should have done. So you've got to give me something better. And then it goes on to say, such is the punishment in this life, but greater still is the punishment in the hereafter, if only they knew.
Yeah.
So my confusion is, what happens to these guys who initially don't follow God's will, and do follow God's will, expecting more, but what's going to happen in heaven?
Yeah, so we don't know. The story doesn't, flesh that out. But what the story does show is that they acknowledge they're wrong, and they come back to understanding God and God's will. And it parallels the story of Adam and Eve in the Quran. Yeah, Adam and Eve in the Quran, they both disobey God. They follow, I shouldn't say follow, they listen to the advice of Satan to go partake of this tree. Satan doesn't make them do this. Satan says, you should do this, and gives a bunch of reasons, and then Adam and Eve, on their own choice, make that. They realize that they've done, and they say, oh Lord, we have wronged ourselves, and then God teaches them sort of the art of forgiveness, or the words of forgiveness, and then God forgives them. So that's the nutshell story of Adam and Eve in the garden in the Quran. And this sort of is a type of parallel to that. To me, it feels like that. People who have sort of either forgotten about God or put God on the side are reminded about God's power and God's will. And then they ask for forgiveness. And it's not necessarily that they're expecting something like physically better. It's sort of a general expression of understanding in sort of Islamic theology that this difficulty is happening, but God is good, God is loving, God's plan is positive. There's some benefit that will come out of this. I don't know what it is. Maybe it'll be now, maybe it'll be later, maybe it'll be in the hereafter. So it's not necessarily a transactional statement that it sort of may sound like initially to you.
Yeah, no, I guess what's more confusing is such is the punishment in this life, but greater still is the punishment in the hereafter of them being new. So this is the punishment that they're talking about if they never ever made the allowance, they said that, oh, this is God's will.
Yeah, so the last two phrases are sort of a general reminder that, there's, you want to be held accountable here, not in the hereafter. It's better to try not to weasel out of things here, if you can. And so during the prophet's time, there are people that came up to him and said, I did X, Y, and Z. Please punish me for that, because I want to be held accountable here, not in the hereafter. And in again, showing that, like, the prophet would respond with, like, were you at Friday prayers? Were you with us during this prayer? And the person would say yes. And like, well, you have asked for forgiveness, so be confident that God has forgiven you, right? So these things are sort of an ongoing balance of, I think also that the prophet is sort of making a sort of emotional quotient judgment call. He's saying somebody is showing sincerity that A, they did something wrong, they admit to it. They believe in God because they want to be held accountable now, not in the hereafter. So they must believe that there is God and that there is an accounting. And so somebody that has that sort of heart the prophet chooses to remind them that you should be confident in God's mercy and love and forgiveness too. If somebody were to say, so like, how close to the line can I go and still get away with this? That's the kind of person maybe the prophet would have a conversation of, like, the judgment of God, blah, 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 blah. Right? So you're sort of reading the person, and the prophet gave different hurdles to different people. Some of his closest companions, he expected a lot more from them. He knew that, okay, you know this, now implement it this way. Now have this spiritual practice. You've had this spiritual practice, but I still see you getting angry with your children. You need to, like, be able to, like, live it out in more broader ways. Whereas there are other people that would come up to him who were more, let's say, I don't have a good way of putting it, let's say simple-minded folks. And they would ask for, like, what do I need to get into heaven? And he would give them, like, a simple prescription. So these were sort of like simple desert folk. And so he would sort of read people in different ways. And scholars to this day do that too. I think I had mentioned a story, I don't know here, I keep getting mixed up which stories I've mentioned. But there was a prominent Muslim American scholar when he was training in Egypt. Near the end of his training, they do sort of like counseling, but in public. Like after Friday prayers, people will come up in lines to the scholars and ask them questions. Could you pray for me? Or how do I do this? Or should I do that? And things like that. And so this person came up to this junior scholar and said, a friend of mine had an affair and was wondering what they should do, what's going to happen to them. And so this junior scholar, he sort of starts reciting chapter and verse, like if you commit adultery, blah, 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 all this stuff will happen. And the senior scholar sort of pulls his collar back and says, what are you doing? He's like, well, this person committed adultery, so you're asking what's going to happen to them. It's like, A, it's not a story about a friend, it's this person. B, this person, you can see in their voice and their eyes, they've come here They know that they've done something that God has asked them not to do. They're wondering right now is not the fact whether what they did was bad or good. They're wondering, is there any hope for their redemption? That's where they're at right now. And so they need to be reminded that there is. They don't need to hear chapter and verse about what's wrong. So there's always there's good preachers and bad preachers that know how to read a situation and share the kind of guidance that they need at that time. There is both justice and mercy in God's plan. Sometimes we need to hear the justice part to sort of keep us in line. Sometimes we need to hear the mercy part to give us hope. So, I guess we're almost on 15. We'll continue with this. Obviously, we got through about half of it. This was a little bit longer, so I'm not surprised. And we'll kind of get back in line with this one when we next meet up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Are you hosting people this year?
I am, yeah.